Hi friends, as we bring our study of 1 Samuel to a close and open 2 Samuel, we're at a transition point. Death often marks a transition of how things used to be and then makes way for new or different things to take place. So I have a challenging question for us to begin with today. What is your view of death? And in retrospect, have you experienced healthy transitions where there was a death involved, or does that only represent really negative things for you? Have a chat. So 1 Samuel closes with the description of the death of King Saul and his sons. 2 Samuel begins with a heartfelt lament mourning their deaths by David. So let's read 1 Samuel 31 and 2 Samuel 1. Now, the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. And Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa, and they cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. And they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Chapter 1, 2 Samuel. After the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head, and he came to David. He fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from the battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. And he turned around and saw me, called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered, and he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord." Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, Where are you from?" "I'm the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And then David called one of his men and said, "Go, strike him down." So he struck him down and he died, for David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you neither dew nor rain, may no showers fall on your terraced fields, for there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they are not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war have perished." Eugene Peterson states, "The way we deal with loss and death enters into the atmosphere and makes us a people capable of nobility and beauty or not. In order to live totally, we must face death totally." Again, we see some contrasts between how Saul and David are participants in the events described in these chapters. Saul, warned of his impending death, chooses death rather than facing humiliation and torture at the hands of his enemies. Swiftly, wordlessly, he falls on his own weapon, which was wielded as a threat to David, now used to his own demise. Amazingly, David does not gloat nor rush in on the kingship. God graciously orchestrates events that David would still be in Ziklag, which prevents David's implication in Saul's death. One might think that David and his men might actually celebrate the news given that Saul, who has relentlessly pursued him until he can't even be in his own land, but in fact, verse 11 and 12 state clearly that David grieves and all his company grieves with him. It is important that we do not grieve alone. The messenger who tells David of the deaths of Saul and his son expects a reward and instead is met with an execution on the basis of his own testimony, whether that was even true or not. This again shows David's innocence and loyalty. He grieves and acts for the sake of Saul's honor. Somehow, although David has already been chosen as the next king, he is able to get his mind off himself and focus on the community and the public reality of the loss. Israel is now without a king and even without hope. Death has a way of permitting us to focus on the larger realities, to begin to transcend the details of petty hurts and affronts. The true and the best must be remembered and be brought forward. David, who lives exuberantly, also laments fiercely because Life matters to David. And there's another stark and appalling contrast to our culture today. I don't know about you, I'm a bit of a news junkie. Every day I watch the news and hear endless reports of death and disaster. About that, we hear pontifications, moralizations, analyses, endless analyses, and interviews, but no lament. Life is just trivialized to gossip. Lament reminds us that life matters. 70% of the Psalms are laments. They either originate in or derive from the praying life of David. 2 Samuel 1:18 lets us know that David, in fact, sees that lament needs to be taught and worked into our lives. We need to teach one another how to take seriously the great cadence of pain, sometimes coming from hate, weeping, pounding our hands on the table. Life is not supposed to be like that, which is actually characterized easily in David's thorny relationship with Saul. He could have many times said that. Life isn't supposed to be like this. And sometimes it comes from love, characterized in David's deep friendship with Jonathan. Like David, we are actually deepened and strengthened by both. We find God in the middle of both and discover beauty, truth, and goodness that can infuse our life with a hopeful purpose. We discover that pain isn't the worst thing. Being hated isn't the worst thing. Being separated from those you love isn't the worst thing. Death isn't the worst thing. The worst thing is failing to deal with reality and becoming disconnected from what is actual and disconnected from truth, beauty, and goodness in the process. This trivializes the honorable. Let's go to another table talk. Have you heard, sung, or participated in lament? And what do you think of even when we talk about lament? So, rather than lament, addiction and depression are our most popular methods of denying death in our culture. They also lead a person to isolation. Addiction, which is actually also known as an attachment disorder, ranging from workaholism and alcoholism, preoccupies many individuals in our culture and drugs us with the impersonal, numbing us so we lose the capacity to deal with personal details and the intimate feelings of loss. Depression doesn't usually begin as a denial, but more like a distraction whose cumulative result of years and years of minimizing the realities of loss and death, failure and disappointment leaves us just dulled and unresponsive to all reality. As a culture, approximately 40% of our adults are on an antidepressant, and a growing number of youth aged 13 to 18 are now being treated in this fashion. I would describe lament as synonymous with grieving well. We have not learned to grieve, and we don't entertain a hiatus in our control of life to allow for grief. We just try and get on with things as best we can. But grieving or lament gives us permission to acknowledge that we are not in control. If we are not taught to grieve and lament, We'll grow up believing that if we allow ourselves our immediate feelings of sorrow, it might determine all of our future, our fate, and ultimate destiny. Some people think if they start crying, they never will stop. So if we just don't acknowledge these deep and sorrowful feelings, maybe they'll just go away on their own. And if we don't talk about it out loud, maybe people will not think we're vulnerable and no one will even notice. And we can go on. Deny rejection and you will be controlled by it. Avoid frustration and you will be diminished by it. We are vulnerable and we become empty shells by denying and pretending, thinking no one will notice. Where there is no grief and lament, there are barriers to newness, and we get very stuck. Lament is not a cure-all. Recovery is often long and complex, but having the courage to face reality is our most promising preventative. We don't become mature by trying to circumvent loss or avoid it, or get lost in distracting ourselves. Learn to lament. We are mortals. We will all die. Try as we might, it is not in our power to control life and death. We learn to deal with death and loss in the context of God's sovereignty, which is fully expressed in the resurrection. Death and loss and sorrow is temporary. We're told to take up our cross and follow Jesus because it prepares us for the resurrection. Jesus states in John 12:24, "Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." Paul expands on this in 1 Corinthians 15:36, "What you sow does not come to life unless it dies." And in verse 42, "So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable, but it is raised imperishable." The resurrection does not just tell us, well, deny death, or get over it, or make little of it. There can be no resurrection without death. And the resurrection is our primary way for staying in and participating fully in God's very large and capacious story. So learn to make the most of your losses without getting bogged down in them. And here's some practical ideas that I've found helpful on how to make the most of a time of grieving. First of all, accept your feelings. They are real, and they need to be acknowledged and expressed. Talk it out, cry it out, pray it out, sing it out, write it out. Journaling is a wonderful way to struggle with, identify, and release what is going on inside of you. Feelings may come in waves. Pull the car over and have a good cry, and you can move on. These feelings are temporary, and they will subside like the ebb of a wave. Secondly, trying to escape into loneliness or just deny what is happening is the wrong approach. Taking up a new hobby might be a good idea, especially if you can include others in it, but slow down on major commitments and purchases. I know of people who've jumped into a marriage and then in time found out that it was a mistake. Thirdly, friends are important. David did not grieve alone. And although there is a private element to grief, support groups, counseling, friends, and family members, including children at their own age-appropriate level, they need to help walk alongside of us, and you need to walk alongside of them and shoulder the burden together. Finally, postpone these major decisions that involve transition for a time if you can. Take a deep breath. and breathe. Give yourself the opportunity to walk through the process, not run. We will see in the chapters that we cover in the next few weeks how David does take action with deliberation after allowing time for lament. Brueggemann states, "When shall we find the words, and who dares to sing of intimacy broken, of losses unspoken that must be spoken, of greatness overwhelmed by the savage power of death?" David sings about the poignancy of human anguish. Where there is such singing, the unresolved hurts can be resolved. Time alone does not heal. Time well spent will. God will do something new, but it can take time to acknowledge and sorrow for what is gone. This is time well spent, and lament and grief becomes an act of courage and stunning humanness that throws itself on the grace and glory of the resurrecting God. This following Psalm of David is a good example of lament and petition. Maybe you can identify with him as he throws himself on the mercy of God to meet his need. Psalm 86. Hear me, Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Guard my life, for I am faithful to you. Save your servant who trusts in you. You are my God. Have mercy on me, Lord, for I call to you all day long. Bring joy to your servant, Lord, for I put my trust in you. You, Lord, are forgiving and good, abounding in love to all who call to you. Hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for mercy. When I am in distress, I call to you because you answer me. Among the gods, there's none like you, Lord. No deeds can compare with yours. All the nations you've made will come and worship before you, Lord. They will bring glory to your name, for you are great and do marvelous deeds. You alone are God. Teach me your way, Lord, that I may rely on your faithfulness. Give me an undivided heart that I may praise you and fear your name. I will praise you, Lord my God, with all my heart. I will glorify your name forever, for great is your love toward me. You've delivered me from the depths, from the realm of the dead. Arrogant foes are attacking me, O God. Ruthless people are trying to kill me. They have no regard for you. But you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Turn to me and have mercy on me. Show your strength in behalf of your servant. Save me, because I serve you just as my mother did. Give me a sign of your goodness, that my enemies may see it and be put to shame. For you, Lord, have helped me and comforted me. I pray that all of us will have the courage to face our times of grief and sorrow, to take the time for lament and be comforted and helped by our Lord, who is making all things new.